Jeff Waage, who is going to be talking to us. Let me give you a microphone. About this.
Volunteered by a group, and when I first came today, because I actually work more in the interface of agriculture and health, but when I first came today, I sort of wondered, am I in the right meeting? And fortunately, thanks to Belinda's talk and Fabrice's talk and a few others, I feel that there might be a value here, but I have to say the person who really thought this might be useful was my co-author, Georgina Mace, who said, you really ought to come and give this talk. This is a project that I've worked on with her and a lot of other people, basically an interdisciplinary program. I need the slide clicker. Okay. It's actually a program that's been operating over the last 2 years between two London-based interdisciplinary organizations, my own, the London International Development Centre, which works on development problems across the sectors represented by a lot of small colleges that work in health and in economics and other areas, and within one big college in London, UCL, the Grand Challenges program, which is a similar interdisciplinary one. And we've been working on a project on sustainable development goals, and particularly working across different sectors. So we've had about 40 people representing everything from mechanical engineers to molecular biologists working on HIV/AIDS to sociologists and anthropologists and vets and pharmacists, looking at the Millennium Development Goals, which I'll show you one more time, though I think you all know them now from all the presentations, so just memorize these because it's important, those 17 goals, because we'll be coming back to them again and again. And basically looking at the interactions between the goals and focusing over the last 2 years on how can we better understand how these goals are going to be implemented given their diversity and their interactions. So I'm not really talking about ecosystem services, not directly about environmental services, but I'm hoping that what comes out of this might be interesting in terms of how the subject of this meeting fits into the broader framework of the goals and their implementation. But that's for you to judge. So it all starts from an idea of looking at interdisciplinarity in the SDGs, and particularly about linkages between goals. And the original idea came from some work that was done by our center with The Lancet, a commission in 2010 on the shortcomings of the MDGs. It wasn't really about the shortcomings, but there were 3 particular shortcomings in the Millennium Development Goals. One related to the lack of links between goals, the silo problem that we all know about. Another was equity issues. The way in which goals were achieved were reaching the most reachable communities, which made a bigger gap between the poorest and those who'd been improved. And then finally, the ownership issue. There were goals from the north for the south. Now, very interesting, the SDGs have done a really good job at the last 2, I would say, but they really haven't tackled the first one very well. Though many of the targets, and we've heard today, many of the indicators are beginning to try to say, well, what is the effect that health might have on other goals or education and other goals? And that might emerge as we refine that process. So what we did, and this is just a very quick background, is we did some initial intersectoral and interdisciplinary workshops. Everybody in a discipline wrote a paper for the other disciplines in readable language about what had happened in their particular goal areas, what progress had been made, what is being planned for the SDG frameworks. And then we looked at, as a result of this, we all sat together and looked at the potential interactions that could exist between goals. And you don't have to read this, but we came up with a matrix of interactions. So these weren't all the goals, but there were major goal areas. So like agriculture, biodiversity, climate, education, energy, governance, human health, population, growth, urbanization, water. And this matrix basically showed from our analysis and comparison where goals interacted more than others. And the orangey bits were where there were strong interactions, and the blue bits where there were weak interactions, and the directionality of those interactions was also recorded. And then we began to look in areas where there were goals, which were clusters of goals that were strongly interacting, like you might imagine between agriculture and climate change, or between human health and education. then we looked more deeply in groups. And we looked at analysis of clusters of interacting goals. And in the end, what that revealed was something rather unexpected, which is our main result, an emerging pattern and a challenge about how goals can be governed individually and collectively. So I'm just going to present that to you. It's a framework to understand the potential conflicts and synergies between goals and governance of their interactions. And I think it has direct relevance, particular relevance, around the issues of sustainability and environment. Now, I've drawn a bullseye diagram here because this framework basically looked at how we can link goals that have similar properties, both in terms of what they deliver, but in terms of their governance as well, and what that then tells us about the interactions between goals and their implementation. And so our concept really found that goals fell into three different categories, which we put as sort of concentric circles. And the first is, there's a set of goals that deals with individual and collective outcomes. They're people-centered goals that aim to deliver individual and collective well-being through improved health, education, and other areas, ensuring equitable distribution within and between individuals and countries. And these goals, now I realize, I'm sitting in this room, that you can't read these, but I can just tell you they're goals 1, 2A, 3, 4, 5, 10, and 16. And they relate to things like ending poverty, ending hunger, and ensuring health, ensuring education, achieving gender, reducing inequality, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies. They're well-being goals, okay? And those are goals that have a lot in common, and I'll get to that in a minute, but they all have to do with improving well-being. They're sort of the end goal, the proximate goal to human well-being. And then there's another set of goals, which are actually quite new for goal setting, which we tend to call here infrastructural goals. They're goals that relate to networks and mechanisms for the production and distribution, delivery of goods and services which support well-being. And these infrastructural goals draw on natural resources to generate what is needed for the essential functions of modern society. And those goals include ones about respect to access to affordable energy, sustainable agriculture, resilient infrastructure, sustainable inclusive economic growth, cities, and sustainable consumption and production. All these goals really relate to the infrastructure that delivers those outcomes. And they're all very similar in the sense that they all relate to something that uses natural resources to generate well-being outcomes. And then there's a third set of goals, which one might call environment and underlying support systems that relate to the management of global resources and public goods, such as lands, oceans, climates, biodiversity. And while these biophysical systems are not dependent on human activities, necessarily, they strongly influence and are influenced by them. And I need not say that to this audience, clearly, but that's, and those goals are the ones that you'll be familiar with. They relate to the oceans. They relate to water, which sort of fits across also into the infrastructure side of things. They relate to climate change, and they relate to terrestrial ecosystems. So the benefit of characterizing goals in this way, we feel, helps us to understand the process by which we realize well-being outcomes through activities which translate environmental resources into those outcomes. There's one more goal, which is strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize global partnership for sustainable development. That's the sort of throwaway goal that we're all going to do this and work together nicely, just like goal 8 in the MDGs, which nobody ever really did anything. It had no goals because it was a goal for rich countries. It had no targets. It was just nice to put at the end, as we see again. So I'd now like to talk a little bit more about these in the context of governance. And by governance in our project, we meant institutions, mechanisms, processes backed by political power and or authority that allow a set of activities to be controlled or influenced or directed in the public interest. That's a rather long-winded definition. We had a lot of political scientists in our team who wanted us to be quite precise about what governance was. And it's quite clear that although there was some initial discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals having an overall governance goal, that's not going to happen. Just like the MDGs, the SDGs will have a polycentric governance posing challenges for linking goals and their implementation. And I think the diagram I've just showed you helps that being visualized. So let me go through these different levels and tell you a little bit about what we think the governance challenges are. So first of all, these well-being goals, they are, in fact, you might have recognized the heartland of the MDGs. The MDGs were effectively, you know, a set of goals about human well-being with a desultory effort involving the environment and a desultory effort involving production systems like agriculture that came up in a hunger sub-goal. So they were really about health, education, gender, and so on. So it's the heartland of the initial MDGs. They have enormous potential for positive synergy and win-win interactions, for instance, those that exist between health and education, which we're beginning to realize now. They have well-established institutional structures, very similar governance mechanisms. They've been in place for a long time. They've got an enormously long public sector history. That doesn't mean that during the course of the MDGs they came any closer or out of their silos, but the potential is very clearly there, largely because it's a public sector governance structure that applies to almost all of them in almost all countries. Although privatization is becoming a more important part of health and education around the world, there's still a pretty strong public sector role. And their interaction with infrastructure goals, that is the next level, are strong and mutually supportive. That is, not only do those infrastructure goals generate the services that are necessary for education and health, you know, that turn on the lights so kids can read and do their homework at night, or provide the food that we eat, but also healthy people, happy people, equitably serviced people also are much better at generating those services through those infrastructural activities. The infrastructure goals are really the odd ones out. They're largely new to international goal making. There's a potential for very strong negative interactions between them because they compete for limited natural resources. They you know, agriculture and cities, and we've heard about it today. They compete for water, they compete for biodiversity. There's no strong public sector institutions or governance structures in these goals. They have a very strong private sector component historically. And they have the particular challenge of mediating the potential negative trade-offs between the outer level environmental goals and the well-being goals. So they're in a tough position, and they're relatively new. Now, I need not speak to this audience about the environmental goals. They have a strong potential synergy between goals. For instance, the conservation of forests has a tremendous contribution to make to climate change mitigation. Their governance and institutional structures are characterized by weak conventions that are poorly coordinated, and because of their intergenerational nature, they tend to attract little support from constituencies. Though hopefully next month we'll learn differently. Their success is largely dependent on the sustainability challenges, that word sustainability that's been stuck in all the infrastructure goals with perhaps not enough attention to how that will be achieved. So interestingly, if you look at it this way, the governance challenges for these different kinds of goals are quite different. Relatively easy, though by no means not challenging, for the MDG heartland, the inner goals. It's particularly challenging for the infrastructure goals and extremely challenging for the environment goals. And how they link together and relate to each other also poses such challenges. And I'd just like to conclude by the comment in our conclusion that the infrastructure goals are really the critical governance challenge here. For a couple reasons. They're the least developed in terms of institutions and governance. The decisions made about infrastructure, and I'm talking about cities and energies and water, the use of water, are not always in the public interest. They tend to be dominated by powerful elites and experts like us. And a nice example would be a dam project, okay? So we need energy in this country. What do? Well, we build a big dam. And of course, I think you all appreciate that that doesn't necessarily take into account the interest of all the people, but generates energy for the wealthier part of a population at the expense often of the poorer rural part of a population. It's not likely that the kinds of first reactions of governments to these kinds of goals will be, we have to think about a sustainable energy at the local level, or sustainable water at the local level. The first reaction will be, what have we done in the past to generate lots of energy really quickly? Well, we dug some coal and we burned it. And that's going to be the initial reaction. The combination of private interests, weak accountability mechanisms, a lack of transparency means these goals may be implemented without balancing natural environment and well-being goals, and in a way that increases contemporary and intergenerational inequalities. And I think that was something I particularly got from this symposium, is the focus that ecosystem services work has on the issue of equity and equitability. And this is a particular challenge in these goals. So I just conclude by, with our conclusions, that designing goal implementation and governance to realize synergies and remove conflicts between goals is of paramount importance now. And that the particular challenge is going to be on designing governance structures that deliver these goals relating to agriculture, infrastructure, and others. And I think Fabrice made a very good point about, you know, how we're going to reconcile agricultural goals with environmental goals. So there's a need to particularly focus on those. And there's also a need to place emphasis on democratic debate around the governance of infrastructure goals to ensure that they deliver resources sustainably to all. And given the current way in which those kinds of services are delivered, that's going to require a particular and new effort. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. That was a very nice new viewpoint on a topic we've all been thinking a lot about. So hopefully it's generated some questions and thought-provoking comments from the audience. We have about 5 minutes for questions, but we also have the poster session and drinks, so this can carry on as long as we want it to. Any questions for Jeff? Sam, I'll come to you now.
Well, Jeff, thanks very much for this presentation. We don't have much time here to talk, but I'll just pose one question. You see, the issue of governance, is it coupled with the issue of financing? I watch you all through. You never mentioned that critical element. Another issue is issue of technological capability in the South. I know that is not related to governance, but there is no way we can address the issue of the infrastructure goals without really talking about technological capability in the South. So the first is a question, the second is a comment. So please address the first question.
Great. I'll just come to Sam for his question, and then maybe you can respond, Jeff.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that thought-provoking input to the symposium. I am an African, and I'm very concerned myself, particularly when I look at myself, look at my neighborhood, look at my country, look at my continent, and I know that people are not necessarily becoming wealthier, they're becoming poorer. There is a lot of movement around developing international conventions. The SDGs, for example, the MDGs, we have the WSSD, and all these processes that have been going on. Yet, the drivers of change in our economies has actually not been the international community. It has not been the scientists or academics. It's politics. It is foreign direct investment from multinationals. And this has, of course, contributed to quite a bit disempowering the poor who depend on the natural ecosystem. My concern here, and I think you've basically brought it out, is the power of the private sector, and of course the national, regional and international private sector, and the fact that this is of course disempowering the poor, and how maybe this can be mitigated, because in the long term, not maybe in the long term, in the medium term, as development practitioners and as scientists, we are concerned about some of these things. I don't know that you have any thoughts, looking like, it looks like you have put quite a bit of investment in thinking around these things. Has anything crystallized towards how we can do these things? Or at least address some of them?
Okay, Jeff, over
Great.
to you.
Thanks very much. Well, one of the things I could say at the outset is when you do an interdisciplinary project and elect somebody to talk about it, then they don't have to know everything about all the disciplines. And I feel a little bit challenged here by these excellent questions. But let me try to address them. I think both of them really focus a little bit on private sector issues, because the finance issue is, when you think about the dialogue that went on in July about goal financing in Addis Ababa, there was a rather strong familiarity with the way in which international financing might assist some of the well-being goals around education and health and so on. And there was quite a lot of discussion about what role the private sector could play in helping the financing of goals in other areas, particularly around sort of agriculture, the economic growth, and so on. But I'm not aware that there are any really good resolutions about that. And I think, however, most of the international contributors to financing would feel that it is not their role to finance the engine of economic growth through industry. And so I think there's a dilemma unresolved there. And with respect to the private sector, I think the issue, well, many here will know more about engaging the private sector than I have, but the issue with respect to these goals are perhaps that government has a considerable regulatory power with respect to the private sector in terms of what might be done around agriculture. You know, and at the moment, it's not necessarily exercising that in an African context with respect to how land is being purchased and used, but it has that potential. In agriculture, it's focused on food security. One of the issues is its environmental problem. Outside of that, there's probably going to need to be considerably more opportunities to find incentives for the private sector to contribute to the infrastructural goals. And it seems to me that the issue that we sort of came up with after some deliberation about this was to set the goal agenda as a consultative, participatory process, which allowed the voices other than the private sector, other than the large company private sector, to speak. And of course, farmers are private sector, so I don't mean to exclude them. I simply mean to say that most governments listen to very large private sector initiatives and foreign initiatives. So the idea would be, perhaps, the way to approach this is to create a dialogue on local goal setting, and each country will be able to pick and choose from these goals which ones it wants to prioritize. That seems to be the pattern that's emerging, to make sure there's a broad public dialogue that's inclusive, and not go immediately to the people who might say, yes, we can deliver energy, we've been doing it for years. But that's just a personal thought.
Thanks, Jeff. That was very interesting and some great questions and comments. It's now time to start looking at posters and have a glass of something, but I'm sure Jeff will be around having a glass of something, and you can ask him a question or discuss this topic a bit more. Thanks to all the speakers and to all of you for your attention since lunchtime, and enjoy the rest of the conference.